Man, when I saw that Game Freak was making a AAA game outside of Pokemon, my first reaction was total suspicion. We've known this studio for over 20 years for basically making the same formula, so seeing them pivot to a photorealistic action RPG in Unreal Engine 5 is like seeing your conservative uncle suddenly decide to get a giant back tattoo. The context behind this, the so-called Gear project created by Satoshi Tajiri about 10 years ago to encourage original ideas within the company, is the kind of thing I love seeing in big studios, because it shows there's room for creativity beyond the product that pays the bills. What makes me curious is that development started back in 2020, but the game was only officially announced in 2023 under the name Project Bloom. And look, that is a huge gestation period for a studio that normally releases Pokemon almost every year. I actually see this as a positive sign. When a team spends so much time without market pressure just refining a concept, it's usually because they're trying to nail something outside their comfort zone, and that usually results in more genuine, even if riskier games. I found director Kota Furushima's statement interesting, saying that the photorealistic style wasn't a calculated decision, that they simply followed the feeling they wanted to convey to the player before defining the genre or mechanics. Personally, this kind of inside-out creative process is rare in AAA productions, where usually it's the opposite. You define the genre to sell, then fit the atmosphere around it. If this is true and not just post-fact marketing talk, it's a much more artisanal development than I expected from a studio this size. But here is where my suspicion kicks in. Only a small part of the Game Freak team is directly on the project, and most of the work was outsourced to external partners. This is a common practice in the Japanese industry, but when you have a small studio handling mainly the creative direction, while the bulk of the work is done on the outside, the risk of vision inconsistency increases a lot. I've seen this go wrong in other games where the soul of the project gets lost in the middle of outsourcing, so this is something I'd keep an eye on as more gameplay is revealed. The publisher history is also curious. The game was supposed to come out through Private Division, from Take-Two, but then it switched to Fictions, a new publisher in the market. Switching publishers midway usually indicates internal restructuring, whether due to rights, budget, or release vision, and that is almost never a minor detail. I can't know the exact behind the scenes, but this switch makes me think the development process went through turbulence that we are only seeing from the outside now, months before launch. On the other hand, the fact that the director came from Pokemon's battle and sound systems is interesting to me as someone who follows action games. He isn't a guy with zero combat experience, but he has also never led a project of this scale alone before. This leaves me in an ambiguous position because, on one hand, it's good to see someone from inside Game Freak taking on this responsibility instead of hiring an outside director just to give it AAA credibility, but on the other hand, it's the first time he's testing this leadership on such a larger scale, with a real market deadline and giant expectations on top of him. At the end of the day, the development context of Beast of Reincarnation gives me the feeling of a studio trying to prove to itself, more than to the public, that it can exist outside the Pokemon bubble. The premise really hooked me, to be perfectly honest. We're talking about a Japan in the year 4026, completely destroyed by something called Blight, where the protagonist Emma was born affected by this corruption and therefore has the power to manipulate plants, but at the same time lives isolated because she is feared by everyone. This kind of character, marginalized by their very existence, is something that always interests me, because it usually opens up space to explore themes of rejection and identity in a deeper way than your typical chosen hero. And I really hope Game Freak takes this seriously in the narrative, and doesn't just leave it as flavor text. The detail that caught my attention the most was the fact that Emma has no memories or emotions, which is a dangerous concept to execute well. In my gaming experience, emotionless protagonists either work brilliantly, like 2 billion from Nier Automata, or just become an empty shell that the player never truly connects with, and then the whole narrative falls apart with it. From what's been revealed so far, it seems her journey will be precisely about rebuilding that humanity alongside the dog Ku, which is an interesting dynamic, but I've seen this promise go wrong many times in games that promise an emotional journey and deliver generic mascot companion cutscenes. Ku by himself is a curious narrative choice, because he is classified as a malfact, meaning he is exactly the kind of creature that Emma, as a sealer, should theoretically hunt. This fundamental contradiction between the two characters, where one should eliminate the other, is the kind of narrative tension that I think can yield a lot if handled well, because it creates a constant internal conflict between duty and bonding. But I'm also afraid they might resolve this too quickly in the story just to justify the partnership gameplay, like those games where the clearly dangerous companion is accepted without question in 5 minutes. The ultimate goal of the journey is pretty straightforward. They need to go to the far west to face this beast of reincarnation, which is the source of all the blight. And for that, they need to go through the corrupted forests and defeat the great malefax called Nushi to absorb their powers. Structurally, this is very classic Japanese RPG, like collect the fragments and powers to face the final boss. Which isn't necessarily bad, but makes me question if the narrative will have truly surprising twists, or if it will be a linear point A to point B journey with a new skill reward for every Nushi defeated. What I find interesting from a thematic standpoint is this idea that the world itself changes because of the blight, with corrupted forests sprouting out of nowhere in desert terrain. This creates a constant atmosphere of instability that can be very well utilized narratively, especially if they use this environmental mechanic to tell visual stories about what happened before and what is happening now, like those environmental world-building moves that games like Dark Souls and Nier do so well. But again, that's potential, not a promise, because a lot depends on how much effort they put into scenario details and hidden lore. There's a line in the game's official description that left me intrigued. Explores what it means to be human. That's a heavy promise, man, and I'm always suspicious when I see this kind of phrase in marketing because it usually doesn't deliver even half of what it suggests. The theme of humanity in a post-apocalyptic world with an emotionless protagonist is fertile ground for exploring real existential questions, but it's also very easy to fall flat and become just pretty trailer talk that doesn't translate into meaningful narrative moments within the gameplay. Overall, the story of Beast of Reincarnation seems to me to have more thematic potential than most recent Japanese AAA games, especially because of the dynamic between Emma and Ku and this issue of rejection and the reconstruction of humanity. My bet is that it will be a competent but not revolutionary story, although I would love to be wrong and be surprised by something truly memorable. Emma's katana combat seems fast, precise, and with that highly polished action feel where every strike carries weight without feeling too heavy. What catches my eye is how enemy attacks are well telegraphed and the parry window seems generous, which for me is a relief, because I enjoy parrying but hate it when the timing is ridiculously tight. The system with Ku is what makes me the most curious. Instead of just being a companion that attacks automatically on its own, he operates with commands that somewhat resemble a turn-based RPG. You open his menu, time slows down, and you can pick the right skill on the fly. This generates points based on Emma's perfect parries, so the combat isn't just pure reflexes. It looks like the game wants you to think about the rhythm of the fight, not just spam buttons. I really like this mix. Progression also seems intelligently tied to gameplay. Defeating these giant Nushi transforms areas and unlocks new powers that Emma absorbs. It's not just generic XP farming. It seems every major victory changes how you move and fight afterwards. This reminds me of games where exploration and combat feed off each other, and I absolutely love it when that actually happens. Regarding movement, Emma using her blight-infused hair as a grappling hook to jump high and even create bridges seems to me like one of the most fun parts of what was shown. It's not just a regular grappling hook. It looks like the map was designed for you to feel fluid, taking shortcuts and climbing in creative ways. If this holds up in the full game, exploration should be very satisfying. What leaves me a bit in doubt is the balance between Emma's frantic action and the more tactical moment of Ku's menu. In trailers and demos, this seems to flow well, with the slowdown giving you time to breathe. But I keep wondering if in more chaotic fights, this won't break the pacing. Still, the proposal to mix reflexes with tactical decision-making seems fresh to me, especially coming from Game Freak. Another point that hyped me up is how Ku can be commanded mid-combat to help actively. He's not just passive support. He actually enters the brawl, and that reinforces the one person and a dog idea that the developer itself uses. For me, this gives real personality to the gameplay, because you're not alone on screen. There's always this duo dynamic happening. Just with what's been revealed so far, the gameplay of Beast of Reincarnation seems cohesive, fluid, and full of its own personality. Sharp combat, creative movement, progression tied to bosses, and this command system for Ku that mixes action with a tactical touch. I am genuinely curious to see if in the final game all of this stays as well put together as the previews suggest. It seems to have the potential to become one of the year's good surprises in terms of combat feel. The first thing I thought when I saw the trailers was, did this really come out of Game Freak? We're used to Pokemon's colorful and cartoony look, and suddenly a game drops with photorealistic graphics in Unreal Engine 5. Full of dynamic lighting, cinematic depth of field, and textures that look real. It's such a massive visual shock that, honestly, the first few times I watched it, I was more impressed by the technical leap than by anything else in the game. Director Kota Furushima said they never deliberately planned to go for photorealism, that it came about naturally because it was the style that best expressed the concept of a cruel, post-apocalyptic world. I like this explanation because it makes sense. An anime or exaggerated visual style would soften the heavy atmosphere they want to convey way too much, and the realism helps make the blight in the corrupted forests more threatening and believable. Still, part of me wonders if it isn't a bit of pretty talk after the visuals were already defined. The world is very realistic, but the character designs retain a slight manga stylization. This mix avoids that wax figure effect that many photorealistic games fall into, and at the same time makes Emma and Ku stand out in the hostile environment. To me, this shows that someone on the team thought beyond "let's make it look pretty in Unreal 5" and actually cared about readability and visual personality. Now, being perfectly honest, I still look at these trailers with a grain of salt. We know that promo material is always the best angle, the best lighting, and zero pop-in. In recent games from Game Freak themselves, we've seen the abyss between trailer and final product, so I can't 100% buy into these visuals until I see lengthy gameplay under real conditions, especially in open areas with lots of mutating vegetation. The risk of the game not maintaining this level the whole time is real. The color palette also caught my eye. Instead of the vibrant colors we associate with the studio, everything here is more mature, somber, and dramatic, with tones that somewhat resemble the atmosphere of Nier, or even certain moments from Software games. This helps a lot in selling the idea of a destroyed Japan in 4026. I like how dirty and heavy the visuals look, without falling into the generic gray of many post-apocalyptic games. Another point that makes me curious is how they will handle the scenery transformations, like plains turning into dense forests because of the blight. If this is done fluidly and with consistent visual quality, it could be one of the game's biggest graphical triumphs. But if there's pop-in, textures loading right in your face, or overly abrupt changes, it will break immersion instantly. For now, we've only seen this in controlled trailer moments, so it's still speculation. The graphics of Beast of Reincarnation are, from what we've seen so far, the most confident and well-resolved aspect of the project. Game Freak has never been a photorealistic studio. The director himself admits that this doesn't match their vibe, and I'll only truly believe it when it's running on my PC for hours on end, without marketing cuts. Until then, I'm rooting for it, but keeping one eye wide open. I've seen a lot of people hyped about the combat and art direction of Beast of Reincarnation, but let's be honest, performance is the elephant in the room that no one wants to address. Game Freak confirmed Unreal Engine 5, and that carries a track record we know all too well. Shader compilations stutter in the first few hours, hitches when loading new areas, and a heavy reliance on upscaling, DLSS and FSR3, to mask what the raw hardware can't handle. It's not pessimism, it's the standard. The PC requirements are terrifying, to say the least. A minimum of 24 gigabytes of RAM for 1080p at 30 frames per second with upscaling in performance mode, and 32 gigabytes recommended for 1080p and 60 frames per second. This on a game that doesn't even have confirmed ray tracing. To put it in perspective, Cyberpunk 2077 with path tracing asks for 20 gigabytes. Either the optimization is very green, or Game Freak is aiming high to ensure no one comes complaining about out-of-memory errors at launch. Either way, it excludes a lot of people who can run Elden Ring or Stellar Blade smoothly on medium settings. On consoles, the conversation changes, but remains cloudy. PS5 and Series X will get native versions, but to this day, less than 2 weeks from launch, there isn't a single confirmed graphics mode. No 30 frames per second, no 60 frames per second, no target resolution. For a Souls-like where parrying lives or dies by input latency, this is a deafening silence. The game's own official performance page lists this as an open question that will only be answered on August 4th. The Series S, then, is the big unknown. Everyone knows that Unreal Engine 5 on hardware with 10 gigabytes of shared VRAM usually means drastic cuts, aggressive dynamic resolution, streaming textures popping in, or a hard cap of a locked 30 frames per second. The fact that Xbox lists the game as handheld and cloud play on Game Pass smells like a mitigation strategy to me. If the Series S chokes, they push you to the cloud or to Steam Deck via streaming. It's not a solution, it's an escape. Speaking of Steam Deck, Valve still hasn't given it the verified or playable badge. The official page admits that battery stable settings and verified status are unknown. For a game that asks for 24 gigabytes of RAM on PC, Running it on the DeX APU without turning into a 15 frames per second oven will require a miracle of optimization or visual cuts that turn the game into something else entirely. If you're thinking of buying it just for handheld, wait for performance reviews, or use Steam's 2-hour refund window as a paid demo. The bright side, if there is one, is the director's stated philosophy: gameplay first, graphical fidelity second. Studios that assume this early on tend to lock in conservative targets. A stable 30 frames per second is better than an unstable 60 frames per second. And disable heavy Unreal Engine features like Lumen and Nanite. My honest impression is that on PC, brace yourself for shader compilation on your first playthrough and traversal stutter. It's the price of UE5 today, and 32 gigabytes of RAM has become a real requirement, not just window dressing. On PS5 and Series X, the safest bet is a locked 30 frames per second mode with VRR saving the day, because a stable 60 frames per second on Nushi bosses full of particles in an unoptimized engine is dangerous optimism. If you have Game Pass Ultimate, play it there on the 4th with no financial commitment. If you're buying it on Steam, leave the 2-hour clock running on the main menu while it compiles shaders, and pray the day 1 patch isn't empty. To be perfectly honest, Beast of Reincarnation is the kind of game that, from what's been shown so far, makes me more inclined to buy at launch than to wait. Not because it seems perfect, but because the proposal has personality, has identity, and gives off that feeling of a game that can surprise you more when you're experiencing the premiere alongside everyone else. What pulls me more to this side is that the game doesn't seem to be trying to be just another action RPG. It has a strong atmosphere, a different concept, and a combat system that, from what was revealed, seems to have enough energy to hold down anyone who likes a challenging game. And when a game arrives with this kind of presence, it usually gains a lot from the impact of that first experience. At the same time, I'd still factor in a little caution, because launches always carry that basic risk of performance and fine-tuning. But honestly, in this case, I see that more as a precautionary detail than a real reason to back out of buying. The overall impression is of a game with the potential to be worth it right out of the gate, especially for those who enjoy this more technical and dense style. To me, it is recommended mainly for those who like action RPGs with more serious combat, exploration with a heavy atmosphere, and games that have their own identity instead of following a safe formula. I also think it perfectly fits those who like to keep up with launches because they want to experience the game right when the conversation is happening, without just watching after everyone else has already finished it. This game is one of those cases where the desire to play outweighs the desire to wait. It doesn't give the feeling of a game that will only get better with time. It already seems strong enough to grab attention right at the start. And that, for me, already puts it in a very interesting buying tier. The game hits Xbox Game Pass on day 1. In other words, if you're a subscriber, there's no real reason not to play at launch, because the cost of testing it out is basically zero. And historically, when a game goes to Game Pass at launch and turns out to be good, those who play it later end up paying more or waiting for sales that take months to arrive. Playing early in these cases is usually the smartest decision. So overall, I'd say it's more worthwhile to buy at launch than to hold off for too long, especially if you already like the genre and enjoy betting on games with a striking proposal. It still deserves a watchful eye, but the trend right now is that it will deliver a good enough experience to justify an early purchase. Those who prefer to wait always have valid arguments, of course, but games that tend to disappoint at launch usually arrive surrounded by silence and lukewarm previews, and Beast of Reincarnation is doing the exact opposite of that, building confidence with each new piece of material released. In my case, the scales have tipped. I'll be there on August 4th.